Franz Stangl, who became Treblinka's new commandant at the beginning of the September of 1942, brought with him a new vision of Treblinka. Having followed the disastrous Impre des Belles, Stangl was determined not to make the same mistakes that his predecessor made, many of which have already been discussed within the scope of this documentary. However, even with all of his reforms, Stangl's Treblinka would still struggle to cope with the sheer number of victims that it was expected to process, which would only be further exacerbated in light of the imminent Bialystok deportations, scheduled to commence in November. Thus, even with an organised, deceitful, and rapid processing of victims throughout the camp, Treblinka's killing output would still ultimately be too slow, which is an issue that had already been clearly identified in the Ebel era. Although Treblinka was the last of the Nazi extermination camps to be constructed, its design still had major flaws. Chief among them was the simple fact that Treblinka's gas chambers were simply not large enough, and that they didn't have enough of them. When SS Obersturmführer Richard Tomala oversaw the construction of Treblinka, he had clearly underestimated the killing capacity of its original gas chambers, and had likely not been properly informed as to how many victims Treblinka would be expected to kill each day. It was for this reason that the SS and Travnikis had to resort to shooting the victims as they got off the cattle carts in the Ebel era, as the chambers simply weren't big enough or efficient enough to process the staggering number of deportees that arrived each day. Stangl, who was keen not to suffer from the same issue that Ebel had, informed Christian Wirth that Treblinka needed brand new gas chambers, which would have to be larger, more efficiently designed, and, most crucially of all, more numerous. In light of this request, Wirth brought in a colleague from Belzec, namely SS Hauptstafführer Lorenz Hackenholt. Hackenholt, a man of whom will be discussed at great length in the upcoming series on Belzec, was very experienced with gassing facilities, having worked in all 6 of the Aktion T4 killing centres. He was also, rather conveniently, the gas chamber operative at the Belzec extermination camp. Following Hackenholt's arrival into Treblinka, a plan was drawn up to erect 8 much larger gas chambers, although it must be noted that sometimes this number is referred to as 10, and it varies depending upon the account. Either way, these new gassing facilities were far larger and could consequently handle far more victims. Construction commenced in early September, a project that Chiel Wiernik, who is probably Treblinka's best-known survivor, was heavily involved in, given his skills as a master carpenter. During the construction of the new death chambers, transports from Warsaw were still arriving, meaning that the original 3 gas chambers were still operational, much to the horror of Wiernik and his 40 construction workers. Wiernik, in his memoir, A Year in Treblinka, gave an eyewitness account of a gassing he saw during this time. Suddenly, the entrance door flew open, and out came Ivan, holding a heavy gas pipe, and Nicholas, presumably Nikolai, brandishing a sabre. At a given signal, they'd begin admitting the victims, beating them savagely as they moved into the chambers. The screams of the women, the weeping of children, cries of despair and misery, the pleas for mercy, for God's vengeance ring in my ears to this very day, making it absolutely impossible for me to forget the misery I saw. Treblinka's new gas chambers had lower ceilings, meaning that less oxygen was present in each individual chamber prior to a gassing, thereby making the killing process much faster. Unlike the original trio, Stangl's new gas chambers were also connected by a narrow corridor, which ran down the middle of the building, with either 4 or 5 individual chambers on each side of the corridor. In a cruel and sinister jest, Wiernik and his men were also forced to put up a dark ceremonial curtain from a nearby synagogue at the entrance to the gas chambers, which read the following: "This is the gateway to God. Only righteous men will pass through." Upon completion of the new facility, Treblinka's old gas chambers were converted into a tailor's workshop, which was staffed by new arrivals and those already working in the extermination area. Once the new gas chambers were completed, SS Oberscharführer Heinrich Matters was promoted by Stangl to become chief overseer of the extermination area. Matters, who was ironically a male nurse before the war, had served the Nazi Party since 1934, where he originally joined the SA, or Sturmabteilung, mere months before the organisation was purged by Hitler, as part of Night of the Long Knives. Initially serving in the Wehrmacht for the first 2 years of the Second World War, Matters was then eventually reassigned to the Aktion T4 euthanasia program, where he worked in a photograph laboratory. Following a reassignment to Lublin in August 1942, Matters was drafted into Himmler's ever-growing SS, and consequently assigned to work at the recently opened Treblinka extermination camp. Initially assigned to oversee the burial process, Stangl promoted Matters once the new gas chambers were operational, favouring his aptitude for cleanliness and almost apathetic brutality. Described by his subordinates as a sociopath with a fetish for cleanliness, Matters ran the extermination camp with ruthless efficiency. He regularly executed those who he deemed were working too slowly or had breached his high standards of cleanliness. Much like his colleague August Miert, Matters was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Treblinka trials in 1965. He died in prison, aged 76, in December 1978.